Siddhartha Gautama, better known as the Buddha, was a Hindu prince who, according to legend, gave up his wealth and status to seek enlightenment. After achieving his goal, he shared his teachings, founding Buddhism in India during the 6th to 5th centuries BC. Though much of his life story is legendary, he is recognized as a historical figure and was a younger contemporary of Mahavira, the founder of Jainism. Buddhist texts say that at Siddhartha's birth, a prophecy foretold he would become either a great king or a profound spiritual leader. His father, hoping for the former, shielded him from suffering for the first 29 years of his life. However, one day, he managed to escape his sheltered existence and encountered what Buddhists call the four signs: an aged man, a sick man, a dead man, a religious ascetic. These encounters made him realize that aging, illness, and death were inevitable, and that his privileged life could not protect him from suffering. He saw that life itself was marked by suffering and loss. Inspired by the ascetic, he decided to seek spiritual truth. Trying various teachers and disciplines, he ultimately attained enlightenment through his own efforts, becoming the Buddha, the awakened one. He then shared his middle way, teaching detachment from material desires and ignorance through the Four Noble Truths, the Wheel of Becoming, and the Eightfold Path. After his passing, his followers preserved and spread his teachings. The Mauryan king Ashoka the Great later helped Buddhism expand beyond India, making it one of the world's major religions. Historical background: Siddhartha was born in Lumbini, modern-day Nepal, during a period of social and religious change. Hinduism was the dominant faith, but many began questioning its practices, the authority of the Vedas, and the role of priests. Critics argued that Hinduism was not addressing people's spiritual needs. The Vedas, considered divine revelations, were in Sanskrit, a language few understood, leaving priests as the sole interpreters. The caste system, upheld as part of the divine order, kept many in difficult, impoverished conditions while priests lived in comfort. Theologically, Hinduism taught that Brahman, the supreme being, had created and embodied the universe, setting up the divine order. Humans, believed to have immortal souls, were expected to perform their karma, actions, according to their dharma, duty, to eventually break free from the cycle of rebirth, samsara, and unite with the oversoul, Atman. However, many questioned whether this cycle truly led to liberation or just prolonged suffering. Religious debates flourished. Orthodox Hindu schools, known as Astika, upheld traditional beliefs, while others, called Nastika, rejected them. Among the Nastika schools that endured were Charvaka, Jainism, and Buddhism. Early life and renunciation. Siddhartha grew up in this time of change but was unaware of it, as his father kept him insulated from the outside world. His mother died soon after his birth, yet he was raised in luxury, eventually marrying and having a son. However, upon witnessing the four signs, he realized that no wealth or power could prevent suffering and death. He questioned the meaning of life and was struck by the peaceful demeanor of the ascetic, who had already renounced worldly attachments. Determined to seek enlightenment, he knew his father would never allow it, and his wife and son would try to stop him. One night, after gazing at his sleeping family and his luxurious surroundings, he made his decision. Shedding his fine clothes, he donned the robes of an ascetic and left for the wilderness. Some versions of the story suggest supernatural assistance, while others say he simply walked away. Criticism of the Four Signs tale. Some argue that Siddhartha couldn't have lived 29 years without ever seeing sickness, aging, or death. Scholars offer two explanations. The story symbolizes the causes of suffering and the path to relief. It was created to give Buddhism a distinguished origin. Scholar John M. Kohler addresses the first point, stating, "Most likely, the legend of the four signs is more symbolic than literal. They may represent key existential crises in Siddhartha's life, triggered by encounters with sickness, old age, death, and renunciation. More importantly, they signify his deep realization of these truths and his belief that peace and contentment are achievable despite life's inevitable struggles." Scholars Robert E. Buswell, Jr. and Donald S. Lopez, Jr. note that the story of the four signs was written over a century after Buddha's death. Early Buddhists sought to show that his teachings were not new but rather a rediscovery of an ancient, timeless truth, lending Buddhism the same divine origins as Hinduism and Jainism. Whether the story is fact or fiction, it has been embraced as truth. It first appears in full in the Lalitavistara Sutra, 3rd century CE, and likely evolved through oral tradition. Its symbolic nature is evident, and its role in strengthening Buddhism's standing against established faiths seems probable. Ascetic life and enlightenment. Siddhartha first studied under the renowned teacher Ashoka Kalama, mastering all he had to offer. However, the attainment of nothingness did not free him from suffering. He then learned from Madraka Ramaputra, who taught him to suppress desires and reach a state neither conscious nor unconscious, but this also failed to satisfy him. Turning to extreme asceticism, likely inspired by Jain practices, he survived on just a grain of rice a day but still found no answers. In one version of his journey, he nearly drowns in a river, barely clinging to life before hearing a guiding voice on the wind. In another, a milkmaid named Suja, mistaking him for a tree spirit due to his emaciation, offers him rice milk. Revived, he abandons extreme asceticism and heads to Bodh Gaya, where he sits beneath a Bodhi tree, vowing to remain until he discovers the path to end suffering. In deep meditation, Siddhartha reflected on his life and the nature of suffering, realizing that its root lay in attachment. In a moment of enlightenment, he understood that suffering stems from the human tendency to cling to impermanent things. Everything, one's identity, possessions, desires, is in constant flux. By recognizing this and letting go of attachments, one could break free from the endless cycle of craving, striving, rebirth, and death. In this moment, Siddhartha Gautama became the Buddha, the enlightened one. Tenets and teachings. Though he had achieved inner peace, Buddha chose to share his insights and help others free themselves from suffering. His first sermon at the Deer Park in Sarnath introduced his Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. The Four Noble Truths are: life is suffering. Suffering is caused by craving. Ending craving ends suffering. There is a path that leads away from suffering. The fourth truth points to the Eightfold Path, a guide to living without attachment. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. By following these principles, one can escape the wheel of becoming, which symbolizes existence. At the hub of the wheel sit ignorance, craving, and aversion, forces that keep it turning. The rim depicts conditions that cause suffering, such as attachment, grasping, and self-illusion. The wheel's movement represents the cycle of rebirth and suffering. Through this practice, one still experiences loss, pain, and disappointment, but not as unending suffering, dukkha, which arises from ignorance of life's impermanence. The Buddhist path allows for joy, but with the understanding that nothing lasts forever. Buddhists compare this realization to the end of a dinner party. When the meal is over, one thanks the host and goes home. One does not despair over the evening's end. Life, like the party, has a beginning and an end. Instead of mourning what cannot be held onto, one should appreciate the experience and let it go. Conclusion. Buddha called his teaching the Dharma, meaning cosmic law, not duty as in Hinduism. It is based on the undeniable truth that thoughts shape reality and actions have consequences. As the Buddhist text Dhammapada states, our life is shaped by our mind. We become what we think. Suffering follows an evil thought as the wheels of a cart follow the oxen that draw it. Our life is shaped by our mind. We become what we think. Joy follows a pure thought like a shadow that never leaves. Each person is ultimately responsible for their own suffering, as they have the power to choose whether to engage in attachments and thought patterns that cause distress. Buddha continued to share his teachings for the rest of his life until his passing in Kushinagar. According to Buddhist tradition, he attained Nirvana and was freed from the cycle of rebirth and death after consuming a meal prepared by his student Kunda. Some scholars speculate that Kunda may have unintentionally poisoned him. Before succumbing to dysentery, Buddha requested that his remains be placed in a stupa at a crossroads. However, his disciples divided them among themselves and interred them in 8 or 10 stupas marking significant locations in his life. Later, When Ashoka the Great adopted Buddhism, he had the relics unearthed and reinterred in 84,000 stupas across India. Ashoka also sent missionaries to spread Buddha's teachings, and Buddhism flourished in countries like Sri Lanka, China, Thailand, and Korea, where it became even more prominent than in India, a trend that continues to this day. Siddhartha Gautama's legacy lives on, inspiring people worldwide to embrace his teachings and follow his example of appreciating life's beauty without attachment.